43-year-old former Army sniper, counselor, wife, and mother, Brenda Thurman, was rushed to the hospital on a cold January morning in 2016, ostensibly the victim of a tragic accident. The evidence, for the most part, aligned with this conclusion. It was a devastating end for a trailblazing, loving, and strong woman. But questions arose only a week later when a colleague of Brenda's was also inexplicably killed in what police believe was yet another tragic accident. Were the two deaths completely unrelated, unfortunate but utterly unconnected events? Or was it possible that this was more than a coincidence? It was just about 9 a.m. on January 18th, 2016 in Spokane, Washington. From the upper level of the Thurman family home, Gabrielle, the adult daughter of Brenda and Dwayne Thurman, heard a loud bang from downstairs. She thought at first that the sound may have been some dishes crashing to the floor. Then she heard her adoptive father, Dwayne, call out to her. She didn't respond immediately. It took a second, more desperate cry out to her to bring Gabby down the stairs and into the kitchen. There, lying on the floor next to the kitchen table, was her mother. Dwayne held her in his arms. She was bleeding from a gunshot wound to the chest. The Thurmans live only 2 miles from Valley Hospital. Wasting no time, the two collected Brenda into the car, Gabby at the wheel and Dwayne on the phone to 911. They rushed to the hospital. Spokane County deputies followed the car to the emergency care. Brenda underwent surgery. But unfortunately, the efforts came too late, and she could not be saved. Deputy Jared Keene had followed the Thurmans' car to Valley Hospital. He walked into the waiting room and found Dwayne Thurman sobbing. Dwayne was described as hysterical. He needed to be moved away from other patients and families due to the disturbance he was causing. At one point, Dwayne vomited into a sink. Deputy Keene asked him directly what had happened in the kitchen of his home. Dwayne responded, "It's my fault. I'm an idiot." The gun just went off. Brenda and Dwayne Thurman had been married for 18 years. They raised Brenda's 2 children together, Gabrielle and Michael. By 2016, both kids had grown into adults. The two had met while both serving as military police in the Army. Brenda was known as a trailblazer. She was one of the first women to go through training at the U.S. Army Sniper School. After leaving the service, she continued to work with veterans. Brenda pursued a master's degree and began a career counseling military veterans through the Veteran Health Administration. She has been credited with helping dozens of vets to overcome emotional and mental trauma and to better their lives.
She was the best. She was always there to help no matter what, and she was there for every one of our Gold Star families along with our veterans.
Dwayne had taken a similar route in his career, choosing to also go to work for the VA. He worked with homeless vets to get them into housing. The Thurmans' marriage was described by many who knew them as a strong one. Under the surface, however, there may have been difficulties that the couple kept private. In August of that year, for Brenda's birthday, Dwayne purchased her a teal .380 Glock handgun. The day before her death, they went to the shooting range together. Shooting was an activity that they could share. The aim, Dwayne said, was to hopefully reconnect after a period of tension in their relationship. On the 18th of January, the day after they had been at the range, Dwayne sat at the kitchen table and prepared his gun, as well as Brenda's, for cleaning. There was no magazine in the gun. By Dwayne's account, he had seen Brenda check for a loaded bullet. Dwayne Thurman claimed that he was certain that the gun was safe to disassemble. Despite his apparent certainty, as he manipulated the slide of the handgun, it went off. He wasn't sure if he had pulled the trigger.
I understand you're a reserve officer up in Lincoln County.
Yeah,
What do you do full time for?
I work for the VA hospital.
The VA? What do you do there?
I help homeless vets get into housing.
Are you ex-military?
Yeah, we both are.
Tell me what happened. How did it happen?
It was an accident, man. Oh my God.
Dwayne Thurman told detectives that the teal-colored Glock pistol was failing to eject casings some 95% of the time when firing at the range the day before.
First time taking her gun out, we were excited. I bought her a gun for her birthday in August.
First time you guys went shooting it?
Yeah, first time taking it out. It was having problems shooting around. Sometimes wouldn't eject, stovepiping sometimes.
The gun was stovepiping and jamming?
Yeah.
Dwayne stated that the gun was stovepiping, an issue that occurs when a casing does not eject out of the gun after it is fired and instead remains wedged in the pistol. Dwayne said that they brought the weapon home from the range with a casing still wedged inside. That morning, he and Brenda went out for breakfast. He sat down at the table to break down the gun shortly after returning home.
How long were you home before the gun went off?
20, 30 minutes.
What were you doing just before it went off?
I just started to break it down. She came over, she sat in front of me, she started looking on the internet on what's the problem, what's going on with them. I started to take hers apart, and it went off.
The scene in the Thurman's kitchen appeared to align with the story Dwayne told. Cleaning products for the pistols were out and ready to use. His gun, as well as Brenda's teal-colored pistol, were also out. The chair where Brenda had been sitting was pushed out from the table. The iPad that Dwayne had stated that she was using was on the floor. Spokane County investigators continued to scrutinize Dwayne Thurman's account. They learned from him that there had been problems in the couple's relationship. Indeed, Dwayne claimed that they had jointly agreed to have an open marriage. His children confirmed that their father had affairs over the years, a fact that he openly admitted. This admission was somewhat unavoidable. A woman that Dwayne had become involved with began texting him during his interview with police. Dwayne insisted, however, that the behavior was mutual. Brenda had been seeing a colleague at work, he told them. Dwayne stated that he did not know the identity of the man that Brenda was involved with, only that he knew it was someone that she worked with at the VA. Law enforcement interpreted Dwayne's actions in the immediate aftermath of the gunshot as being characteristic of behavior following an accident. Calling out for Gabby multiple times, rushing to the hospital in his own car instead of waiting on an ambulance, calling police to meet them at the hospital. These were all signs that he had not intentionally fired the weapon. Gabby, however, disagreed. There had been some time that passed between the noise that she heard in the kitchen to the time that she made it down the stairs. When she did, she found Dwayne holding her mother in a state of distress, but not performing CPR. He was not rendering medical aid of any kind. Gabby, who had served 7 years in the U.S. Air Force, proceeded to try to help her mother breathe. While doing so, Dwayne asked her to find her phone to call 911. She found the request at that point very upsetting. Why had he not already placed that call?
That he did not appear to be doing much or anything to try to provide any kind of emergency or medical assistance to her. They did take her to the hospital, but apparently the wound was fatal.
When the deputy arrived at the hospital behind them, Gabby did not hesitate to offer her assessment. Her father, the man who had adopted and helped to raise her, had intentionally shot her mother. She asked the deputies to arrest him.
In cases like this, when there is a discharge of a firearm resulting in the death of a human being, you have to take a look at all the facts and circumstances and try from that to distill what the intent of the person who discharged the firearm was.
Despite Gabrielle's firmly held suspicions, Spokane County detectives did not have the evidence they required to pursue any charges. The county medical examiner, Dr. Sally Aiken, determined that the bullet that killed Brenda Thurman struck her directly in the center of the upper chest. The doctor concluded that the death was an accident. She said that she could have ruled the death a homicide, but made her assessment based on information she got from Spokane County Sheriff's detectives who attended the autopsy. Based on the circumstances that they outlined, the gun appeared to have been fired accidentally. Dr. Aiken was informed that there was a lack of apparent intent. In an act of circular logic, the designation by the medical examiner that Brenda died accidentally caused the death investigation to slow to a halt. It was no longer considered a likely homicide after the medical expert stated it was an accident. One week following Brenda's death, another employee of the Veteran Health Administration, 49-year-old Chief of Surgery, Dr. John Marshall, went missing. His wife Susan, a former surgeon herself, made a call on the morning of January 26th to report her husband missing. He had a surgery scheduled for 8 a.m., but had not arrived at the hospital.
What are you reporting? My husband didn't show up for work today. He's chief of surgery at the VA hospital, and they've been looking for him because he was supposed to start seeing patients at 8.
Okay, and what's his last name?
Marshall.
And his first name?
John.
And no reason for him to be gone?
No. And I called both hospitals.
Okay, do you want to list him as a missing person?
Yes.
The search for John Marshall began immediately. Law enforcement tracked the doctor's movement from the YMCA at 5:30 a.m. that morning, where he had arrived to change for his regular morning jog. Security cameras captured him leaving personal items in his locker and then exiting the Y dressed in his jogging shorts and jacket. He carried with him his iPod Nano and wired headphones. John's regular path took him along the Spokane River. Search efforts centered around the river, where a walking path ran next to a steep embankment, leading down to the rushing water. The bank of the river, however, was deep. It was thought that if John had slipped from the path, he was not likely to have fallen all the way into the river. Regardless, this is where the teams began searching.
He had a schedule ready to go this morning. His car was still left at the YMCA parking lot, so it concerns us for sure.
Susan, concerned that police did not share in her sense of urgency, assembled her own search party to walk along the water as well. By nightfall, the police were forced to suspend their search. At 9 a.m. the next day, a man in the North Coast Life Insurance Company building reported seeing a body in the river. Rescue crews found John Marshall floating next to the bushes along the north bank, just downriver from the Monroe Street Bridge.
Located a body in the river, and through visual identification, clothing, and just a visual inspection, have preliminarily identified the deceased as the doctor missing yesterday afternoon.
Dr. Marshall was found fully clothed, his jacket zipped. Both shoes as well as both gloves remained in place. Floating face up in the water, his positioning suggested the unsettling thought that he had been purposefully placed in the water. Indeed, there was a clear path down to the place where he was found, which was right on the bank of the river. Next to him in the water were 2 tubes, a garden hose, and a second piece from a bike. He was found in the exact spot that Susan and those she called for support had commenced their search the day before. At that time, there had been no sign of John.
His death could be related to any kind of medical emergency? if you suffered something like a heart attack up here on the trail, you would be hard-pressed to end up all the way down there in the river. It is possible, we suppose, that someone jumped Dr. Marshall as part of a strong armed robbery or a long-standing grudge, but given his training by two different branches of the military and his time deployed in Afghanistan, Dr. Marshall would have been a hard man to kill unless he was ambushed.
Police speculated, based on the area of the river where the doctor was found, that he could have fallen or jumped from the Monroe Street Bridge. Investigators looking into John's life explored the possibility that John had committed suicide, and then they dismissed it. Dr. John Marshall was both a Marine and an Army veteran. While working in South Korea, he met and married Susan, who was also an Army surgeon. There, the couple adopted their 2 children. The family had relocated back to the United States 5 years earlier, when John had accepted a role at the VA hospital. At that time, Susan took a step back from her medical career to be a full-time mother. They found some evidence of financial struggles in the past and some marital issues. Susan later stated that they had been in counseling, but they found no indication that John was depressed. Furthermore, he did not appear on any of the security cameras that morning, which covered the length of the bridge.
There are no indications that this individual would have jumped off the bridge. Clothing is intact, and no other indicators of extreme force going into the water.
The working theory was that John must have slipped further up the river and fallen into the water. At that point, he had been caught up in a whirlpool near the base of the bridge that kept him underwater for 24 to 27 hours, roughly the length of time he was missing. Overnight, he emerged to be found in the morning. The autopsy did not show the types of long fall injuries that should have been present had the bridge been the point where he entered the water. The examiner did uncover blunt force trauma to his chest. This was explained by potential damage incurred once in the water or from his impact initially with it. The death was ultimately ruled an accidental drowning.
We are certain at this point that it's not a homicide. We're not looking at foul play in this case. Looking at all other possibilities, Detective Sesnick has worked very diligently on this case and is continuing to follow up on some other leads and other information on this case, but it hasn't quite finished his investigation yet.
Spokane Detective Sesnick, who worked the John Marshall death investigation, wrote in April 2016 that, "At this time, I cannot say for certain what caused the death of John Marshall. Though I have not found any evidence that anyone else was involved with the death of Marshall, I cannot definitively eliminate the possibility that he was a victim of foul play." Within a single week, the VA in Spokane had lost 2 notable employees, a counselor and their top surgeon, to tragic accidents. Could these events have been more than mere coincidence? Reports from colleagues and friends initially varied. Some stated that it was unclear if Brenda Thurman and John Marshall had even known each other, though Brenda was due to transfer to the same hospital where John worked that very week. There were others, however, that were certain the two had crossed paths, literally, in fact. Multiple VA workers reported that John and Brenda would accidentally bump into each other in the hallways regularly. According to these sources, the two were almost certainly romantically involved. Facing the determination from law enforcement that the death was an accident, Susan Marshall hired former police detective turned private investigator Ted Pulver. Ted set out to explore the scenarios and leads disregarded or under-pursued by law enforcement. These included the possibility of a secret affair with Brenda Thurman. John's clothing was not dirty or torn. There appeared to be no indication on his person that he had fallen from the trail. His iPod Nano remained in his pocket, his wired earphones still attached, dangling from the iPod into the water. Most suspicious, the iPod showed no indication of water damage. Its liquid indicator was clear. The device powered on and functioned perfectly. It seemed impossible that the device had been in a whirlpool for over 24 hours. In addition, there was no obvious place along the river that he could have fallen or slipped into the water.
Dr. Marshall's body was essentially untouched by any obstacles on the river. On the outside of the body, there's really no significant damage to the clothing at all. There was no water that lifted his body up onto that shallow area. His shoes were on, his socks were on, his iPod's in his pocket. When you travel a river, you lose everything out of your pockets. In fact, you're lucky if you're wearing clothes by the time you get through those rapids, and the bodies are usually damaged. That didn't happen in this case.
Ted Pulver theorized that John Marshall had been jumped by 2 or more individuals while on his regular morning jog. Pulver believed the attackers then transported the former Marine to a second location, waited until police called off their search, and more than 24 hours later dumped the body in the river. He pointed to the 2 tubes found floating next to him in the water, the garden hose and black bike tube, as evidence that he had been waterboarded. He was then placed back into the water. Pulver and Susan believed that this theory accounted for the physical evidence, whereas the medical examiner's report did not. Susan Marshall herself, an accomplished surgeon, came to her own conclusion based upon the autopsy report. The blunt force trauma to John's chest, Dr. Susan Marshall determined, was pre, not post-mortem. The damage that she assessed fit what she described as a military-type assassination. She further concluded that John's body had certainly been repositioned after death and transferred into the river. She also pointed to a red line across John's throat, which was not mentioned in the medical examiner's report at all.
So there's no injury of a fall. He has no internal organ damage. He has no femur fractures. Liver's fine. Spleen's fine.
The doctor further stated that every injury on her husband was consistent with being pre-mortem. There were no lacerations that would be consistent with injuries from the river. While Susan actively pursued answers for her husband's death, she uncovered the connection to Brenda Thurman. The widow had no direct evidence of an affair, but she did objectively believe that a relationship between the two was most likely.
She was killed on Monday. On Wednesday, John told me that he had a viewing to go to. And I grilled him about it. I said, "Do you know Brenda Thurman?" And he wouldn't look at me. And he said no. And I said, "Why the hell would you go to the viewing of someone you don't know?" And he said, "It's a VA thing." A viewing is very intimate. He felt the need to lie to me, whatever the circumstance was. I don't think that he was having the kind of affair that was any kind of a threat. I know that he felt the need to lie to me about it.
Do you think he was having a relationship with another woman, Brenda?
Oh, yeah.
You think that's what led to your husband's death?
Yes. No doubt in my mind.
In absence of a formal police investigation seeking justice for her husband, Susan decided to help Gabby and her brother Michael to bring a civil case against their adoptive father for the death of their mother. The civil case would prevent Dwayne Thurman from benefiting financially from Brenda's death, including inheriting his wife's $80,000 pension. But more importantly, the civil suit would expose the county police to scrutiny over the nature of the original investigation. The pending legal action would apply pressure on law enforcement to finally explore the gaps in Brenda's case.
How far was the muzzle of that gun from Brenda Thurman's chest when it was fired? We don't know. That's critical information. Was Brenda Thurman actually looking for information on her iPad as described by Mr. Thurman? Her iPad was never checked to see if that part of his story is accurate. There was apparently residue taken from Brenda Thurman's hand that was never tested to see what it was, which might also indicate what exactly happened here.
In addition to her iPad, Susan Marshall and others questioned why neither Brenda Thurman's nor John Marshall's work laptops or other devices, including their cell phones, were ever searched. The initial investigation found no romantic connection between the two, but it also seemed that they were not looking for one. Brenda's teal-colored pistol had been submitted for forensic testing immediately after her death. Then, it sat in a queue while an under-resourced and overworked Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory worked through other cases. It was 16 months before the gun was picked up for testing, pushed forward in the queue only by the filing of the civil action, which brought with it public criticism over the delay. Once tested, technician Glenn Davis found the gun to be operating exactly as designed. The civil suit was settled for an undisclosed amount out of court, but the lawsuit accomplished something greater for Brenda's family. Following the testing of the .380 Glock, which found nothing at all wrong with it, Dwayne Thurman was arrested and charged with manslaughter. It was not the first-degree murder indictment that they had hoped for, however. The charge of manslaughter meant that the state did not plan to prove that Dwayne fired the weapon intentionally, an argument that they did not believe that they could make. As a result, Gabby's knowledge of Dwayne's affairs were not presented. Indeed, her unfaltering opinion that he had planned the killing was not testified to at trial. It was a very short trial, only a few days, including jury selection. Dwayne took the stand to explain the horrific accident. Through sobs and dabbing his eyes, he detailed the mistake he made in not following proper gun safety.
Oh my God, baby, I didn't know. I didn't know she's...
You disregard the fundamental principles of handling a firearm, this is what happens. And this is what did happen. And that's what Mr. Thurman did.
He made an assumption that a gun was unloaded and it wasn't, based upon all of the things that I told him. It is a mistake of judgment. It is an accident.
The jury of 8 women and 4 men deliberated about 2 hours on the first day and 3 hours the next before rendering its decision. They found Dwayne Thurman not guilty of the more serious first-degree manslaughter charge, which would have implied recklessness. They found him guilty of second-degree manslaughter. In determining his sentence, the judge considered his status as a reserve sheriff's deputy in nearby Lincoln County, also his military career, as well as his many years working as a social worker. Dwayne was given a 5-year term, 2 years for the accident and 3 years for the use of a firearm.
I should have checked. I should have checked. Sorry.
Deputy Spokane County Prosecutor John Love was again questioned as to why evidence of Dwayne Thurman's affairs, the potential financial benefit from his wife's death, and the suspicions of Brenda's family were not introduced at trial.
The case wasn't about the extra information. It was about that moment, that morning, someone didn't take care of a very dangerous implement and another person died as a result of that. So it was really about the carelessness with the firearm. It wasn't about all of the other extra information surrounding it.
Well, there are 2 issues that raises. First of all, why was it charged only as manslaughter if there was evidence of intent? Secondly, if there's evidence that would show Mr. Thurman had reason to intentionally kill his wife, that evidence would also be relevant to whether or not he was reckless in causing her death. So it would still have been appropriate to present that to the jury.
In spring of 2020, Dr. John Marshall's death investigation was placed under review. At that time, Dr. Susan Marshall began to speak publicly about the connection between Brenda Thurman and her husband's case. The review could lead to the reopening of the case in the future. There has not been any direct evidence presented that has linked Dwayne Thurman to the murder of Dr. John Marshall, whose death remains categorized as accidental. Private investigator Ted Pulver has stated that anonymous individuals at the VA have proof of an affair. The nature of this evidence is unknown. From Susan Marshall's perspective, whether her husband had been unfaithful with Brenda Thurman or not is a secondary consideration. The question is whether her husband's murderer believed the two were involved. Rumors at the VA had certainly circulated to that effect. In May 2022, Spokane Valley had a new medical examiner. When the change occurred, Brenda's family saw an opportunity to seek a second opinion. After 6 years of the death being categorized as accidental, the new examiner determined that it was more likely a homicide. Unfortunately, the new decision will not lead to new charges in the case. Dwayne Thurman, found guilty of second-degree manslaughter already, cannot stand trial again for murder. Despite this, Ted Pulver continues to hope that the designation may help to bring justice to both families.
The new medical examiner took a new look at this case, and maybe there will be some justice for one, maybe two families.
Dwayne Thurman was released from prison in September 2022. At the time of publication, Dr. John Marshall's case remains unsolved. And that was the strange case of Brenda Thurman and Dr. John Marshall. Thanks for watching,